Welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to review this book, The Accidental Prime Minister, The Making and Unmaking of Dr. Manmohan Singh by Sanjaya. Recently a movie was also released on this book, based on this book. This book is on Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure in UPA as Prime Minister of India. It talks about the challenges that he faced as the government was a coalition government, and the author also talks about why he wrote this book. He says that there is this tradition in the US about after after every civil servant retires, most of them write their memoirs and they talk about how things transpired and who did what and what led to things happen in the government, and they put it all out in the public. The author of this book is Sanjaya. He was the media advisor to the Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh and the chief spokesperson in the PMO from May 2004 to April 2008. He has also served as associate editor at the Economic Times and the Times of India, and as chief editor of the Business Standard. There are 13 chapters in this book, and we'll talk about all of these chapters briefly, and then you can decide for yourself if you want to read this book, if you find it interesting. The first chapter is about the call from PMO, the call that the author received from PMO that offered him the job of media advisor, and how he accepted it. And then the second chapter is about getting to know Dr. Manmohan Singh. This chapter is about how his relationship goes far back than just 2004 when he was offered this job. He interviewed Dr. Manmohan Singh when Dr. Singh was the chairman of UGC, and he was working with the newspaper, and he interviewed Dr. Manmohan Singh, and after that interview was done, Dr. Manmohan Singh gave him a note saying that this is one of the most important things that I have said in this interview, and this must be in this interview when it's printed on the newspaper, and before you print it in the newspaper, send me the draft of the interview and I'll check if there's if some correction is required. That note was on South Korea. South Korea had recently opened up its economy and the education system of the South Korea, which was very good. And Manmohan Singh felt that it should be included in the interview, and because that was his vision and idea that he wanted to share with the world. What happened was that that interview was printed, and the draft of the interview before it being published was not sent to Dr. Singh. And when Dr. Singh saw that interview in the newspaper, he called up the author Sanjaya and he scolded him that this note that I gave you is nowhere to be seen in this interview, and you have not even sent me the draft. And this led to a little bit of souring relationship between the both, and it continued for a little while, but later on it improved. And then there's the third chapter is about Dr. Manmohan Singh's PMO. What the thing with Dr. Manmohan Singh was that he preferred to work from home, so he made his office in the bungalows where he resided. He resided in 7 RCR, that is the official residence of the Prime Minister of India. Now it's called Sat Local Landmark, but earlier it used to be called 7 RCR. So the author talks about the elaborate security detail that exists in the residence of the Prime Minister of India. That there are two gates. One gate can be crossed easily if you have an appointment, but crossing the second gate is very difficult. The secretary to the Prime Minister must tell to the security detail that this person is expected, and that person then is searched if that person is not very influential. And then when the author got past the security, and then he reached Dr. Manmohan Singh. So after reaching there, he asked him that, "Sir, why are you offering me this job of media advisor to the Prime Minister?" He said that sitting here, I will be isolated from the outside world. I want you to be my eyes and ears. Tell me what you think I should know without fear and favor. So this was basically Dr. Manmohan Singh's way of saying that I'll be in these bungalows and I'll be away from everything, and how we all know that politicians are told and shown what they would like to see and hear, and they end up living in a bubble, and they they get away from the reality, the social reality. This was something that Prime Minister Singh didn't want, and that's why he wanted someone trustworthy to be appointed, so that that person can tell what is going on in the world really. And then the person talks about, which will become certainly very technical, but it is very interesting. There were some very most important people in the PMO who were very influential, and they used to fight with each other so many times. Twice they fought in front of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister was also, very miffed that he was not able to control the bureaucracy in the PMO. He was facing that issue also. There's this very interesting anecdote about M.K. Narayanan, who was one of these bureaucrats. He used to, make joke on a politician or a journalist and say that I have a file on you, because he was in charge of the internal security, and he would joke that to people. And then the fourth is about managing the coalition. We all know that this is a coalition government, which is very fragile and can break, and the government can fall at any moment, and it is a very very big challenge to maintain and keep this government going. So Digvijay Singh, when asked about Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he said that I don't know if he is an overrated economist, but I know he is an underrated politician. This government also had a lot of MPs from the left, and these left parties were famous for the fall of the government, and it had happened in the past that these parties would first support the government and then take that support back, and the government would fall. And then Sitaram Yechuri was the general secretary of one of the left parties, and he said that he would be UPA's watchdog, that their party would be UPA's watchdog, and P.V. Chidambaram was miffed about it, and he said that either way he agrees that he is a dog, and Yechuri could hear it because he was standing just near there. So these are also the kind of instances where the author tries to tell us that so many politicians in this coalition government didn't like each other, and how they behaved with each other, how they said things to each other, but still the government lasted 10 years. Then there's this instance of former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao's death, how he was denied a funeral in Delhi, and there's this tradition that very tall leaders are cremated on the Yamuna banks in Delhi, but he was denied that honor, and his family was told to take him to Hyderabad, where none of his relatives now even lived, and he was denied that cremation in Delhi, and he was not even taken to the party office. There are issues between Sonia Gandhi and P.V. Narasimha Rao from the past, and that is the reason that she didn't want that to happen in Delhi, because it is a big honor, and she in a way took her revenge after his death. And then there's also this thing in the chapter, and that is about how Dr. Manmohan Singh believed that one should deal with his own conscience. He did not, point it out to his ministers that you are a corrupt person and you mend your ways. He didn't do that. He himself was honest, but he didn't take an initiative to, point out to the ministers that don't be corrupted. And then there was a lot of this anti-Manmohan campaign going on within the party and the government, and that also made Dr. Manmohan Singh, because you see, when you are running a government and you are doing a lot for the country, and then these people from inside your party, they want to see you go, and that was what is talked about in the book in a great detail about how there were people from inside the party only who didn't like Dr. Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister. Then the fifth chapter is about responsibility without power. The thing is that, you see, this Dr. Manmohan Singh was the accidental Prime Minister. Sonia Gandhi was the chairperson of the UPA. So many people believe that she should be the Prime Minister because she belonged to the Gandhi family. And Dr. Manmohan Singh was never slated to be the prime minister, but he became the prime minister. There were so many people in the government who were much senior to Dr. Manmohan Singh. For example, say Pranab Mukherjee was senior to him when because Dr. Manmohan Singh was the RBI governor, and Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister. And now Pranab Mukherjee was working under him because Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh was the prime minister. So all of these issues also started to create problems. There were things like that. There's this tradition that when the prime minister walks in, the ministers stand up to show their respect for the prime minister. But there were a lot of ministers who didn't even stand up when the prime minister walked in. Then there was this concept of group of ministers, an empowered group of ministers, which gave them a lot of unbridled powers to make decisions without consulting the cabinet or the prime minister. What this led to was that a lot of power went away from the prime minister, and the prime minister was not even consulted on a lot of issues, and the decisions started to be made. And then there was also this issue of junior ministers complaining about senior ministers not giving them work, and then the prime minister would advise these ministers to please give some work to your juniors also. There is an instance in the book where the junior minister is sitting on the table. The junior minister doesn't even have a single page on his big table because the person doesn't have any work to do because the senior minister is handling everything. And then there's this very, very important quote in the book which is not highlighted, but I believe that this is something that we must take care in our lives, and that is that that there was this foreign trip that was going, and the author told to the prime minister that, sir, I cannot accompany you to the trip because my daughter has an exam and I have to help her with that. At that moment, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh told him, if you don't come, someone else will end up doing your work. Never yield space. I believe that this is not just important about work, but also important about the relationships that we have with people. That if we yield space, someone else will end up taking that place, and that relationship then never stays the same. The 6th chapter is about brand Manmohan. There's this quote in the starting of the chapter that I would like to say. There's no foundation to the insinuation that there are two power centers. I am the Prime Minister. Dr. Manmohan Singh said this in the press conference in the start of his tenure. And there's also this important quote in the book, that is that the country's credibility depends on the PM's credibility. All of this is being said because there was this disbelief among people. How can there not be two power centers in the government? Because Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, Sonia Gandhi was the party chief and the UPA chief. They believed that there has to be two power centers, or there has to be one who would be subjugated by the other. And that is when the Prime Minister was doing a press conference and he said that there are no two power centers, I am the Prime Minister, and he asserted his authority. But this stance of his will change some years later, that also we'll see in the course of time. And also, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was not a very good speaker. That is known to all of us. There's an instance in the book that when the Prime Minister has to, deliver a speech at Red Fort, and the author starts preparing him for that 2 days before the speech is to be delivered. There is no dynamics in the voice of the Prime Minister. There are no stops when a sentence completes. So the author, places a camera in front of the Prime Minister and tells him that, sir, you have to stop here. And also on the page where the speech was written, he made some signs that you have to stop here. You have to emphasize this word, because the Prime Minister was not a very, very good speaker. And then the 7th chapter is about Manmohan's Camelot. Camelot means a castle. Public offices offers the opportunity to be educated at public expense. This is said by Dr. Manmohan Singh. So this chapter is about foreign policy. Dr. Manmohan Singh was very well-educated person. And this chapter talks about the relationship between China and Pakistan, how they helped each other and they were always against India. And the new Kashmir policy that the Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh tried to propound and try to make it work. And then it also talks about nuclear deal, on which there's a whole chapter dedicated in the book, chapter 11th. About this nuclear deal, we'll talk in detail there. Now the 8th chapter is about promises to keep. The Prime Minister had a lot of promises to keep. He said, and I quote, "We want India to shine, but India must shine for all." This chapter talks about the high growth rate that India had under the Prime Ministership of Dr. Manmohan Singh, that was about 9.1%, and also talks about the Sat Sutra of Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. These were the 7 flagship programs of his government, like Manrega, National Rural Health Mission, and Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, etc. And he also talks about this NSE and versus PMO. NSE was National Advisory Council, which is headed by Sonia Gandhi, and she used to advise the government on a lot of issues. And the author talks about the tussle that went on. And then he talks about the credit for a lot of things that Dr. Manmohan Singh did and was given to Rahul Gandhi or the party, or the credit was not given to him. And all of these things are talked about. Then the 9th chapter is about the Manmohan Singh Doctrine. It talks about the foreign policy and how Dr. Manmohan Singh proved that he was not a novice in the field. The chapter also talks about the good relationship that India and Pakistan then shared under the Prime Ministership of Dr. Manmohan Singh, and the good friendship and relationship that he shared with Pervez Musharraf, and how he invited Pervez Musharraf for a match, to see a match in India that was between India and Pakistan teams. And also sometime later, Dr. Manmohan Singh met with Pervez Musharraf, and they reached some deal on POK, and they devised a plan which eventually couldn't work because Pervez Musharraf was no longer at the helm of affairs in Pakistan, because he was changed. They also made this joint terror mechanism which would help India and Pakistan fight terrorism. The 7th chapter is about the 11th chapter is about ending nuclear apartheid. The nuclear deal, it is all about the nuclear deal that India did with US, and Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's first legacy was LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization, when he opened up the Indian economy. But his second legacy that India has is the nuclear deal that he did with US. So one of the biggest foreign policy achievements of Dr. Manmohan Singh's career was this nuclear deal with US. And it happened. NSG allowed India to come into this elite group. But there were problems behind in the country with the left parties and Samajwadi Party. They had an issue with this deal. And because of this, there was a no confidence motion against the government in the parliament, and there was the government was being opposed by Samajwadi Party and leftist parties. Samajwadi Party was first against it, but then SP chief Mulayam Singh Yadav met the president, and the president told him that this deal is in the favor of India, and that's when he decided to not pull the support from the government, and the government anyhow survived with 275 votes, and it needed 272 votes to keep its government afloat. So the government didn't fall, but then there was another challenge that came before Dr. Manmohan Singh, and that was the 2009 elections. 2009 elections, the Congress party fought this election by saying that that if we win, that if the UPA wins, the Prime Minister will be Dr. Manmohan Singh. Dr. Manmohan Singh just had a surgery in February in 2009, and he still campaigned in the heat in March and April and won the elections. But when the elections were won, Dr. Manmohan Singh knew that he had won it because people knew that he would be the Prime Minister and that if they won it. But the parties denied him the credit for that also. There's this quote in the book: there can't be two centers of power. That creates confusion. I have to accept that the party president is the center of power. This is the quote from Dr. Manmohan Singh that he said in 2009. But in 2004, he said that I am the Prime Minister. So this was the change in his stance. The 14th is not as a chapter, but there's an epilogue. It's titled Manmohan's Legacy. In this epilogue, the author talks about the legacy that the Prime Minister left and the lessons that he taught to all of us. That he was a warrior. When the nuclear deal, the Prime Minister had clearly in his mind that the nuclear deal has to go through or he will resign from the post. When there were problems coming in the passage of that nuclear deal, the Prime Minister offered to resign, but the party said that please carry on. The resignation was not accepted. There were times when Dr. Manmohan Singh used to keep his resignation in his pocket so that he would have to offer it at any point in time. So he was a warrior. He was not weak. In that sense, what he wanted to do, he did. He knew that this is something that I will not compromise on, even if I have to resign. And other thing is about the high growth rates. The growth rate of India till 2012 was great, absolutely great, but after that it started to decline and it is still declining. He had very good relationships with everyone. He was intellectual and he was a scholar, and that is something that no one can ever doubt. And UPA 2 was not successful. The author talks about it in some detail, that why the UPA 2 was not successful. The author was in the UPA 1 government for 4 years, and he describes those 4 years in full detail in the book. And I would say that this is a very great read, especially if you are a political junkie who loves to read a lot about political things, how they happen and who did what and who said what. Then it is a great read for you. There is a lot of political readers in it, political leaders in it, and they can know about these political leaders by reading this book. This book is full of instances. So many of them are very funny, very entertaining, and you can feel that you have known the personality of Dr. Manmohan Singh after you read this book. This book is that intimate. So now it is up to you if you want to read this book. Thank you very much for watching.